All right, so in this kind of spin-off section, what we're doing here is taking what we've talked about in our core video kind of week to week around some of the science of anti-fragility, why it's important, kind of what the key takeaways from it. And we're going to try to apply it to the very specific context that, let's say, a high-level performer, maybe you think executive, but really it could be across fields. So these are some of like the top, say, 1% performers. High burnout industries, you could think law, you can think medicine, certainly professional sports. We work with folks in finance, in tech, in aerospace. And so we'll go through, I think, some common scenarios that they might face, how and why anti-fragility might be useful in those scenarios.
I think the question often becomes, it's like, what does it take to be the best at something? And at what cost? And I'll just throw this out here. It's the biggest mistake I made when I got into this business of high performance coaching, is that I just made this false assumption that if they were executing at their best, largely their life they had a sense of well-being. I think that was probably ubiquitous as a thread. And I often found that was not the case. And those people at the top were making massive sacrifices. And those sacrifices, for some, they were willing to accept. For others, they were seriously conflicted. And that tension in many ways brought a whole nother level of stress to their life, along with the guilt that comes along with saying, hey, am I being the best father I can while I'm being a CEO?
Yeah, that's a really interesting dynamic. How do you think our sort of lens on anti-fragility might get laid down or applied to that particular scenario or tension? How does it make you think about or help coach them through that?
I look at our first part, and I think push back if you agree with this, is that we try to get closer to a sense of authentic awareness around people's priorities and values. And for many, I don't know if some people never do this their entire life. They basically just get on this path and they never question it. Maybe midlife, maybe later in life, they start to question it, and they have this, for lack of midlife crisis, where they say, oh my God, what am I doing? For many, COVID allowed that opportunity for some. But I think from our perspective of anti-fragile coaching, it's really sitting down and in a very authentic, layered way saying, what do we want to accomplish out of life? What are our priorities? And how do we want to rank them?
Okay, I'm really, really glad you brought us there. So for those listening, I think this is a really critical distinction, right? When we say well-being and resilience, and we've talked about kind of the dance or interplay between existing and good sort of pleasantness or quote unquote bad sort of unpleasantness, that I think ratio or kind of dance between the well-being and the resilient piece is going to be a little different for every individual. Right? And I think what we find is there are some people who are willing to endure, candidly, really significant levels of distress in some way, shape, or form to lean a little bit more on that kind of resilience and performance end of things, and sometimes sacrifice maybe some of their well-being. And there's people who are going to fall on the other line. To me, the anti-fragile person, or the point you're making, I want you to disagree with me if you're wrong, but for the high performers listening to this, is just know what your ratio is and then be deliberate and strategic about it. Or am I misunderstanding that?
I think that's exactly what it is. I think knowing yourself and knowing your ratio and understanding that balance is bullshit. It's not realistic, particularly in the short term. If you look at it from a meta perspective over time longitudinally, yes, maybe it does look something like balance, but that's why we like this idea of integration and having flexibility in terms of the context, responding accordingly, not getting stuck.
Yeah. And I think we do want to be clear too that like we're not talking about anti-fragile people just gritting and bearing and withstanding burnout culture and burnout environments, right? Like there are, I think, certain limitations or upper limits to some of these things, right? So, but within that, you might have different levels of distress tolerance or goals or sort of anxiety driving perfectionism and things like that.
I think it's just the opposite of that mentality, in fact. All right. If you look at some of these performance models, right, Yerkes-Dodson curve, which is like it's inverted U, right, and the idea is on one side is complete distress, one basically you're running around with a chicken without a head. The other side you're comatose. Your operating system's somewhere in the middle. There's a range for all of us based upon our personality dispositions, our experiences, our genetics, epigenetics. Knowing those constraints are really important. And the idea is with training, perhaps we can increase your capacity, but everyone has a limit. And I think part of being anti-fragile is knowing your limits. Sometimes you do have to walk away.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a courageous move, which has its own implications, not just for you, but for your family and your career.
Knowing your values, right? Which in my world, sort of the flourishing world, I might say like values and your sort of recipe. Mm-hmm. Like what in life is most critical or important to you, right? Being self-aware, having some sort of strategy or tactics for executing on the synergy between those things, right? And then ideally having, this is where I'd go to sort of the performance part of our framework, like having some of the habits and the strategies and the structures and the modes of focus, right, or distraction controllers that allow you to do that most consistently, right? It's really about those three things, not necessarily, well, not at all really, just sort of, like you said, grinning and bearing and being mentally tough and enduring these really toxic situations.
Right. And I also, and I'm going to just think this through, I haven't played with this, but if you look at Lisa Feldman's work, and if you look at this idea of constructed emotions and the
Feldman Barrett, yeah. Lisa Feldman Barrett, yeah.
And the idea is, what is the brain's thing? She would argue it's not thinking, it's about predicting machine, and you're trying to predict what your emotions are going to be in the future, right? And largely prediction. And I think if you don't have these processes in place, right, if you don't, even from the physical end, right, if you don't have some kind of flexibility and fitness in your nervous system, it is very hard for you to predict accurately what you're going to feel, particularly if you don't know what you feel right now, right? So much of this builds upon, kind of taking care of your underlying physiology so that you can predict feelings and make better decisions that are not basically what I would call like a leaf in the wind, where you're prisoner to your underlying impulses and needs in the moment without being able to predict into the future. And that, that's a nervous system fitness perspective. That is both body and mind. It's not just something like this fallacy of cognitive dominance that doesn't really exist.
Well, there's a good segue, and we can start to kind of wrap here. But for those coming back next week, we'll get into the other framework. So we've talked here well-being, resilience, performance, hopefully giving you some ideas about how we would think about helping our highest level performers navigate those three things and sort of that work-life synergy. But we also need to talk about that next three-part framework, which is top-down, bottom-up, outside-in, and you just referenced the bottom-up piece, right? So more to come next week.